My philosophy around leadership has always been if service is beneath you, then leadership is beyond you.
What does it take to lead a major transformation inside one of the world's biggest companies without losing sight of the people who make it happen? In this episode, I sit down with Libby Saylor Wright from Microsoft to explore how real change is built, why culture must come before strategy, and the leadership traits that separate those who talk about transformation from those who actually deliver it. Can you share a bit about your journey and how these diverse experiences actually shape your approach to leadership?
I always tell people, I wasn't born at Coke, but I definitely matured during my time period at the Coca-Cola Company. I had 13 years there. What was cool about coming to Microsoft is because I was new to not only Microsoft, but new to technology, I was bringing a very different perspective. I was hired because I had retail and consumer goods experience.
What's wrong with that, with the previous vision? So why do you think it didn't work?
It was complicated. Yeah, it was very complicated. One of the biggest challenges for any organization, and certainly for ours, is that the number of priorities that we have, keeping the customer or the consumer at the center of what you do, sometimes helps you make prioritized decisions about how we are all marching in the same direction against the same thing.
The other interesting topic I'd like to discuss with you is diversity and inclusion, because you are truly a champion in diversity and inclusion.
I found myself at one point as the president of an organization where we had 200 members. These people were not getting paid by me, yet we still had to do some work and we had to execute something. And so I said to myself, now how am I going to motivate them to want to do this?
Hi everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of the World Class Leaders. So today I'm super excited to have an amazing guest with me as Libby Saylor Wright. And Libby is the operations leader and chief of staff for Microsoft US Retail and Consumer Goods Operating Unit, an organization driving over $5.5 billion in revenues and shaping the future of retail and consumers goods with game-changing solutions. So Libby is also responsible for the organization strategy, performance management, P&L, operations, and people and culture. And prior to her role at Microsoft, Libby was the chief operating officer at Women's Foodservice Forum, the food industry thought leader on gender equity, providing research, insights, and solutions to enable some of the world's most recognized brands to close the workplace gender gap. And prior to WFF, Libby also served in several roles with increasing responsibility during her 13 years with the Coca-Cola Company. Finally, in addition to her professional experience, Libby is engaged in a number of in different capacities as an advisor and board member in many councils and organizations, including Next Up. And if you guys remember, we had the CEO, Lisa Baird, in the show. And Lisa was so kind to introduce me to Libby. So Libby, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Amazing. So as a star, to break the ice, one question asked to everybody is, what does it truly mean to be normally a CEO, in modern times? For you, I can ask you the CEO, but doesn't really matter. In other words, is what does it mean to be a leader these days? And what aspect of the role do people often misunderstand or overlook?
That's a great question. You know what? I think, first of all, this whole notion of leadership in 2025 or leadership in this particular area is taking on such a different dynamic because there are so many people engaged in what it means to be a leader, right? Your leadership is not necessarily about what it is that you are able to do, but what it is that you're able to inspire. So I just say for everybody, that's the way that we need to think about leadership differently, especially with we have 4 to generations in the workplace together for the first time. And so the understanding the dynamics of what it means to be a leader and to support a leader is very different depending on those generations. Having said that, I will tell you the role of a COO is still very much a lot of what it has historically been. It is a multifaceted role that goes beyond operational management for sure. While we still have the responsibility of executing a vision that might come from a CEO or a leader of an organization, in many cases, we are now creating that vision for the organization. And so
Right.
it's definitely changed in that way. But you still have to balance like that stability kind of making sure that, but also with innovation, you're growing revenue, you're obviously looking to be operationally efficient and managing costs. So it's definitely a balancing act between being highly strategic and also being highly operational. I would say one other thing about it, when you talk about what might, not be understood as it relates to the role, I think the role of digital transformation now, right? And the
Right.
operations leader's responsibility for that, as well as culture being something that's really important for the operational leader. Those are probably two areas where it's largely misunderstood in terms of some of the things that we have responsibility for.
Gotcha. Well, that was such a great and deep answer to this question. And I'm glad that you said that because to me, COO, at least in my perspective, my experience in working with a lot of leaders, is the role of a CEO is clearly, put in the box of operation, but the reality there is way, way more things happening in the CEO roles. And any organization is different, in terms of sort of responsibilities vertically that CEOs have or they need to look at. But clearly, transformation is one of the areas that many organizations are dealing with. And talking about leadership and transformation, Libby, you have such an incredible career from, we said earlier, Coca-Cola to WFF and now with Microsoft. Can you share a bit about your journey and how these diverse experiences actually shape your approach to leadership? And you work for such a big, important organization. So I'm sure many other people in the audience today, they are expecting to understand, you know, what has been your journey, working in such a big and important companies.
So thank you for saying that. First of all, I will tell you that my career, I wish I could say that when I started my career, however many years ago, I was like, I'm going to go here, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. That was not, it wasn't some master
I'm
plan.
sure it was.
But I will tell you is that I was always very intentional about making my skill sets and my mindset one that I could be inserted in almost any organization and thrive. So I will tell you, I have spent more than half of my career, though, as a marketer early in my career. That's what led me to the Coca-Cola Company. If you live anywhere in the Atlanta area and you've been have some type of marketing experience, at some point you probably touched the Coca-Cola
Yes,
Company. And so
exactly. Exactly. That's
I
what I
always tell
thought.
people yes, exactly. I always tell people, I wasn't born at Coke, but I definitely matured during my time period at the Coca-Cola Company. I had 13 years there, 6 different roles across those 13 years. So a lot of change and a lot of growth. And I was very intentional about shifting from that notion of being a pure marketer to being more of a general manager, which meant I had to take opportunities that allowed me to expand skill sets in the areas of strategy and business development and innovation, and of course, operations. And so those things were obviously super exciting for me, great opportunity at the company. But what I also have noticed as I start to look back and consider the Coca-Cola Company, consider, WFF, consider Microsoft, is there's been some consistent themes throughout my entire career, regardless of the organization and regardless of the role. And those themes have been kind of around change leadership and strategy, operational excellence, and of course, culture. So I think those are the things that have kind of led and have guided my career in that type of way. When you talk about leadership, my leadership approach has always begun with people. We say this all the time, but the more you focus and start with the team, the better the outcomes. That's just the reality. And it's been proven over and over again. So it's not perfect, but that's where I try to put the majority of my energy is really starting with what's going to drive the people. And culture is critically important. I think it is our leader for Microsoft, Satya Nadella, that actually said that culture trumps strategy. And I will tell you, in every circumstance that I've ever seen, when you begin with a strong culture, it does help guide a strong strategy and then strategy before structure. And so that's always been my method of leadership. My philosophy around leadership has always been, if service is beneath you, then leadership is beyond you. And that's been both professionally and in the community.
Nice.
It's a quote that came from someplace, I don't know who, so it's not mine, but I adopted it and I have lived it for more than a decade. And so, again, unleashing the potential of your team and then, quite frankly, get out of the way.
I love it. I mean, look, it's so fascinating. Whenever we talk about leadership, most of the time, especially, we like many individuals, and especially in this podcast, probably all leaders that are coming here, they essentially talk about the importance of people and culture and how
Right.
they've been instrumental not only for business results, but also to creating the right environment, for the organization so they can thrive. But the reality is, in the real world, meaning in many other places of our planet, there are still leaders they don't really consider people and culture as leverage for creating something meaningful. So, and again, I appreciate the fact that you have clearly put, these two elements, on the top of your agenda as a leader, which to me is speaks highly about you. And it's still a reminder for many people that whatever is happening in organization, whatever happen at work, the real things that really make a difference is the human side of being a leader. So I totally appreciate.
And one thing I would like to add to that, for me, it has been a learning journey throughout my entire career,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
I'm a big believer in the notion of you've got to consistently be learning. What I would say is one of the things that shaped my professional leadership philosophy and approach was my in community leadership philosophy and approach. I found myself at one point as the president of an organization where we had 200 members, which is significant in a community based organization. These people were not getting paid by me. Yet we still had to do some work and we had to execute something. And so I said to myself, now how am I going to motivate them to want to do this? And then I determined if I can motivate 200 people that don't have to listen to me, aren't getting paid by me or any of my entities to move forward towards something in a collective, how do I do that and apply that same type of thinking in my professional world where people are being paid to do a particular job? And so those two worlds blended, and my leadership philosophy adapted as a result.
And I think that is a fantastic example and demonstration of the fact that money in itself, because it's an extrinsic motivator, it doesn't really make any difference in motivating, engaging people to do something extraordinary. And to me, that is such a fantastic reminder of that. Talking about, I mean, you mentioned Satya. I mean, and we all follow him, and it's so amazing to hear him talking about people and culture, especially in Microsoft, of course. And talking about Microsoft, so your current experience, you have led, we discussed this, before getting on the call, that you have led such an important transformational change within the US retail and consumer good operating unit. Um, Most of the people, most of the leaders coming here, other CEOs or other C-suite levels, they at some point they went through some major transformational change, which is clearly something that we expect. But how did your past experiences, talking about your leadership approach, talking about the Coca-Cola, for example, so inform the way you crafted something that for you is critical for change, which is a vision, right? So, and why this putting people and culture at the core of your strategy about change make a real difference? So, walk me through, because everybody talks about vision for change, but what does it mean vision for change for you based on your experience?
It's been great because I've had the opportunity truly to become a change leader. I realize that I've kind of either created or restructured at this particular point, probably 6 different organizations.
Wow.
What was cool about coming to Microsoft is because I was new to not only Microsoft, but new to technology, I was bringing a very different perspective. I was bringing this kind
Mm,
of consumer goods or consumer centric perspective to the role that I had. And with that, I was also bringing this kind of ex marketer, more creative spin on how I learn, not necessarily also how I applied that knowledge, but more so on how do I learn and learning by asking questions, right? Learning by looking for opportunities and then determining what is the biggest opportunity that we have. And so I'm really, really big on insights and facts. I think emotion plays a role, but it shouldn't, be, it should not be overly, it shouldn't be the reason that we make the decisions is based on emotions. There should be some insights, some facts that are driving our greatest decisions, right? And so I knew that that was critically important to kind of use those insights, those facts, find out what the biggest opportunity was, and create a shared ownership for our future. We had an opportunity, we had a vision before, but most people in the organization couldn't articulate it. And if
what's
your
wrong with that?
organization, it was complicated and it was driven on assumption that you knew certain things about the business or the
Okay.
business priorities that everybody didn't quite understand. I
Right.
would also say we are in a matrixed organization where we have a number of different people that have a number
I
of
bet.
different responsibilities. You have to work through finding this kind of balance between the highest common denominator that's broad enough, right, for people to be able to see themselves in it, but then also that is low enough that an individual should care. And I don't think the previous vision was something that was shared and could be embraced by the larger organization, especially those people that may be individual contributors. And we have to remember that the individual contributor is like 80% of the workforce. So if you're only have a vision that resonates with senior leadership or only have a vision that resonates with management, but the individual contributor that actually has the feet on the ground, doesn't understand and doesn't embrace it, you're not going to go very far with that vision. And I think
Yeah.
that was the challenge that we had before. It was not understood and it was not embraced. And so we had to create something that was collaborative and that really was reflective of everyone's connection to the broader mission of the organization.
Can I ask you one question, Libby? I'm super interesting about this conversation about vision for change. Um, Look, we know by experience, all of us, and also by facts, that most people feel like, the change fatigue in especially large organization when they go through a number of change initiatives all the time. Not necessarily one single change, but many changes. So people perception most of the time is, oh gosh, another change. So
Correct.
why this times is gonna be different, right? And these are perception, they are shaping what people do, and our action always shape our perception. So how did you deal with the fact that people, because I have a feeling that because the vision was not the right vision, was not clear enough, people felt disconnected, not feel engaged with the idea of change. How did you make that leap, or allowing people to start to see something positive different? Was just the vision itself, and then or was more?
I think it definitely was more. It was not an overnight vision. It was one where we kind of had stages and gates, right? We started with learning some information, sharing that information with the broader cross functional team, getting additional input, using the input from the cross functional team to continue to shape as we went along. So it wasn't something that happened in a vacuum, and it wasn't something, quite frankly, that happened instantly. I wouldn't say we took a long time because we didn't, but we took the right amount of time to make sure that we were able to work with others and get input along the way. The extended leadership team leaned in as well and gave very specific examples and challenges, as well as ideas and innovation as to how we could work differently. All of those things shaped the North Star, which again is very simple, and then helped us to shape three very specific pillars or strategies to help to bring the North Star to life. So we kept everything really simple. And then also with that, we developed metrics to ensure that the metrics were as simple and aligned with each of the strategies or pillars and could be easily articulated by anybody in the
Great.
organization. So we got a lot of input along the way and crafted it collaboratively. So I think that made a huge difference, and that was different than what had happened before. And back to your point about change happening, I mean, I've been with over the last, 20 years, two major organizations, the Coca-Cola Company and Microsoft. I will tell you both of those organizations, there is some level of change probably every 12 to 18 months.
Mm,
That is the one thing, as we always hear, that is constant, is change. But there's
right.
always some level of a foundation, right? That if that foundation is strong and clear enough, it can be connected to the change that is happening. Now, what we get challenged by, and we're still not, great at it, but we're at least mindful and we work every day to try to
Mm,
make it happen, is how do we ensure that that vision and that change actually gets executed in real life, like in the field, where it needs to matter, where it happens. And so you have to constantly wake up every day, and there has to be somebody accountable for that. Waking up every day, asking yourself, where are we against our mission and our vision? How have we made progress against executing against that? And where are we falling off track? Which also requires a level of prioritization.
Yeah, it sounds like that. That's my assertion based on what I'm hearing. So first is your marketing background, and maybe I have a suspicion that was the reason why you've been selected to run, what you're running in Microsoft, bringing a different perspective, which I'm sure that was in
Yes.
the play, right? But I like the fact about data insight, how that you use potentially your background in data and insights to link them to what could be perceived sometimes as a fluffy statement, a vision that doesn't really have some sort of, ground in the reality of an organization. It sounds like you have been really good on creating or intervening that potential gap between an idea, a statement, a vision to the reality by performance matrix, by keeping, the vision on track. Is that right?
That's exactly right. I mean, that is exactly right. So if you take one of the areas that we focus on, our pillar is people, starting with people, right?
Yes.
We had feedback and information from them through employee engagement surveys that told us where things were going well and where things needed improvement. We used that direct information to kind of create the people strategy underneath our overall North Star. And we very simply decided we are going to use your feedback on what you tell us as the metric by which we will know that we are making progress against these things that you said were
Interesting.
important. Super simple. Something they were already doing, information we already had. Just took a look at it and said, how do we make this an important part of our strategy? How do we start here and address the concerns that they have? So that's the way that we kind of approached it and moved through every single thing. And you are right. I came to this organization again with no technology experience. I was hired because I have retail and consumer goods experience. They wanted the industry experience and likely the marketing and strategy background. And I've always been broad in terms of my approach. Even when I was a marketer, I was more of a business marketer. As an operations lead, same type of thing. I'm looking across the entire business. And so, as such, with that kind of broad perspective, it helps in crafting these types of things.
Yeah, I'm sure. That's why, I mentioned that because I was quite sure that that was your value proposition, if you like, in moving in a very tech-driven organization as a Microsoft. Now, let's talk a little bit more about um, after the vision. So you created a vision that you have been able to identify through prioritization the right things to do, and then measure the effectiveness of that through data, etc. What are the things that happened as lessons, for change practitioners that you can share in your change experience? Because we know that most of the change initiatives, are never smooth, are difficult. We all know about the data. They say 70% or probably more of change initiatives, they either don't get the light or they fail. So, what are the things that from the vision to the final implementation, so inside of that space, was critical, in your opinion, to make change really effective?
I mean, we're still in the middle of the implementation if you really think about it, right? This is
Right.
a 3 to 5 year plan. You always have to do, as many people out there know, situation assessments and constantly ask yourself critical and key questions at big times. One of the biggest challenges for any organization, and certainly for ours, is that the number of priorities that we have and differing priorities that we have that we're constantly trying to catch, right? They're coming from all different areas. They're coming from corporate, from worldwide, from this
Mm,
organization, from that organization. And you're catching it and you're trying to integrate that in to what it is that you need to go and do. So I actually think that the vision helps us with a little bit of the messiness to derive some level of clarity, but it doesn't necessarily help us always in determining how we prioritize
right.
what is first, second, or third, because everything is important. But it does give
Yes.
us a lens by which we filter that, and then we can make some more what I would consider to be strategic decisions about where to start. So we're always challenged with that. The other thing that we're challenged with is it's a matrix organization, right? Everybody has different responsibilities. We don't necessarily always have the same individual goals.
Mm,
So
yeah,
person A wants this to happen because that's how they're going to be compensated
of
or
course.
assessed.
Of course.
Person B wants this to happen because that's how they're going to be compensated and assessed. Again, we've got to look for that highest common denominator where person A and B are charging towards the same direction. And a lot of times, and in a lot of organizations, that comes back to customer or consumer, right?
Mm,
Keeping the customer or the consumer at the center of what you do, at the center of your vision, at the center of your strategy, at the center of your execution of that strategy, sometimes helps you make prioritized decisions about how we are all marching in the same direction against the same thing. And you also should consistently challenge yourself, in my opinion, is are we doing these actions because we've been told to do them? Or are we doing these actions because, again, it makes sense for our common stakeholder and against our common vision? And so those are the things, but it's challenging. It is very, very challenging. And we often struggle with that prioritization and clearly communicating it over and over and over again.
yeah, and that's super consistent with my experience with listed and Fortune companies during change initiatives. Is this disconnection or misalignment sometimes? And again, I don't think it's most of the time is intentional. It's just a result how performance management has been created between individual objective and company objectives. And I think what you just said to me, it's great. In other words, is if the North Star is always the client, the customer, in my opinion, it should be always be that. But sometimes in organizations they start to lose focus on the
Yeah.
real the real stakeholders, so the customer, for in service of many other things like financial constraint or financial gains or the board direction or trend or markets or whatever. That's to me become a sort of liability for an organization, because then you lose really the focus. And I think everything should be driven by that North Star. If it's the customer, is okay, how you setting goals for individuals should be in support, in service of that North Star. How you drive change, etc., should be in support of that. And I
Yeah.
suppose, Libby, that I think there probably is a bigger risk in technology companies, but that it could be just maybe my interpretation, my experience, because technology company, there's so much gray in understanding technology, and sometimes might get more into the features in or their solutions that are losing really focus. It's not definitely Microsoft. I would say there are probably other organizations that are losing that focus about customer because technology and new trends, talk about AI or many
Yeah.
other things, they become prevalent, and they say, oh, well, let's go into the next trend. Is that fair?
Yeah. Oh, that's very fair. I always tell people, and I probably will get myself in some type of trouble. When I was in a food and beverage organization, we were creating a product, right? A product that somebody was going to consume. And so the length of time in which you had to create that product was was lengthier, and it had to go through all kinds of safeguards and whatever.
Mm,
And when you're in a technology company, it's infinite. What you can
yes.
create and what you can do and how quickly you can implement it, it can happen so much quicker. And so that's an interesting learning for me, but it also goes back to asking yourself, why am I doing this? And for
Yes.
whom am I serving?
Exactly.
Because even in a products goods company, we've put things out before that nobody wanted. They weren't ready for it. It wasn't solving a need. It's easier to even to do that in technology. Nobody wants it. They're not ready for it. It's not solving a need. And so we have to constantly ask ourselves the why, and keep that center. So you're 100% right as it relates to that.
Yeah, and the other observation from my experience is what you said before in terms of prioritization. So the number of initiatives, not necessarily all change initiatives, but
Mhm.
a lot of initiatives, they are still very much run by functions, units, departments, for a number of reasons. And again, I think it goes back to what you said before. There are individual priorities or individual objectives that sometimes if they prevail, these initiatives, although they're not anymore in service of the macro change initiative, but they're still present. There's still people that are still running because there is a reason at that level, but it's not necessarily serving the whole. And to me, I think that is a challenge that I always see in leaders, is how to finally say what you're going to stop doing.
Yeah.
And in my
Yes.
experience, is not an easy thing, unfortunately, because there are so many stakeholders and many interests involved.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's also kind of, I think, why you need the notion of diverse thinking,
Yes.
because you need those people who are willing to challenge what may have been historically kind of the status quo or the way that we've always done things. You need somebody that's willing to challenge, because at the end of the day, right, we're here, business exists to make money. What I love about working for a company like Microsoft is our effort to be a purpose driven company, to have social and environmental impact at the same
Mm,
time while we make
right.
money. And so in order for those things to live together, you have to have diverse level of thinking and some tension in terms of the way that you question and approach everything. And so for leaders who lead by just getting along with whatever the group is doing,
Mm,
sometimes it's not in the best interest of the organization. And so I think that having that diverse thinking and some of that healthy challenge is warranted in order to get the best outcomes all around.
agreed. And that's such a great segue to the other interesting topic I'd like to discuss with you, is the diversity and inclusion, because you are truly a champion in diversity and inclusion. I mentioned earlier when I was introducing you. It's been always a central theme of your career, your experience, that you're still pretty much involved inside of this area. How did you champion diversity and inclusion in Microsoft, for example, and apply that to change? I mean, you're just introducing, you were just saying how much is important to have that sort of diversity of thinking when you're involved in change and discussing priority, etc. What other things interesting that you can share in terms of how spending enough time and focus on having proper diversity and inclusion, because to me they always go together, in order to drive effective change?
You make a good point in terms of diversity and inclusion going together. I think, first of all, there's a number of different ways that we articulated diversity and inclusion, diversity, equity, inclusion, and
Mm,
belonging. The reality is all of those things mean different things. They work together, but they do mean different things. And I think they're all pretty
yes,
incredibly
exactly.
important in order to achieve what we really ultimately want, which is kind of this notion of true belonging and kind of true diverse thinking, et cetera. But to that point, this is one of those places where I can go on forever. So I have to be very, very careful here. Over my professional and kind of community kind of work, it's been interesting that it always seemed to point back, whether I was intentional or not, to equity for women, to equity for people of color. Like no matter what I was doing, and I remember when I spent the time at WFF, which was a wonderful experience because I really got to immerse myself in the realities of the information and the
Right.
data to understand where are we beginning and to understand what are the things that we can do to make change in organizations. And so being able to have that experience and now bring that experience with me to an organization that already believes in this was just an incredible opportunity to kind of execute on what I knew to be a true strategy and ways of working. So it was a wonderful opportunity to do that. The business case, for why diversity, equity, inclusion matters has been proven also over and over again. I think
Mm,
what I find and what many people find is, again, it's the execution on that case. So we know why it's important. We know what type of difference it makes to the business outcomes, but also to the individuals in terms of this sense of belonging and getting the best out of people. But what often happens in leadership and in organizations is that we either lose heart because of
mm,
all the other priorities that are going
yeah,
on,
exactly.
or more importantly, we lose courage. And I think that's where people forget. You can, in your mind, know that it's the right thing, and you can, in your heart, empathize and want to do that. But it takes courage to do it over and over again and with consistency. And you remember, I don't know if you know this, but Maya Angelou had that quote, and I'm going to, paraphrase, but out of all of the virtues, courage is the most important because without courage,
Mm,
you can't practice any of your other virtues consistently. Courage
Absolutely.
is what's needed in this diversity, equity, and inclusion space. Somebody has to be willing to say, no, we are going to do it this way and for this reason. And if you, even though you may be a rock star and bringing in a whole bunch of money, aren't aligned to what it is that we're trying to do, then you are not the right fit for this particular environment or organization because we believe this, we execute against these beliefs and these values, and we have the courage to stand by that. And so I think that's where we have opportunity. Now, again, the world we live in, the customers we're serving, the consumers that use their products, they don't all look alike. So that's why having a lack of inclusivity, particularly in decision making, does not lead to the outcome that we want and that's best for our stakeholders and end users. So I often apply a combination of those insights and facts to this is what we know to be true. Then I encourage people to empathize and understand with the situation. In fact, we do a number of sessions that are just about listening and learning from each other based on unique dynamics of our journey as individuals
Wow.
and allow
Mm.
people to learn within Microsoft. We take an hour almost every month, open it up to our entire retail and consumer goods operating unit, and let people hear from people that in theory they would believe are different than them, and let them hear their journey and learn something. But the biggest thing that we try to do is make sure we take some kind of action, because just sitting around and empathizing with the problem doesn't necessarily create newness. And we want to take action from that as well. So I'm super happy to be part of an organization that still values diversity and inclusion, because I really do think that's how we're going to get our best outcomes.
And if you compare what you have found in Microsoft to other organizations in the US, do you really see how diversity inclusion is valued and appreciated? In other words, you feel like we are all more sensitive and taking more responsibility to, allow diversity, in thinking, decision making, in leadership, generally speaking, or that is still, one of the biggest issues that we need to face as business leaders worldwide. We haven't really yet solve this challenge.
I don't know how I would define the notion of solving it, right? So it's interesting. I would say we absolutely still have work to do collectively in order to see all of those things come to fruition. I know a lot of stats as it relates to women, and I don't want to go into all the stats, but if I just take women as an example, we still have quite a ways to go. It used to be that we'd say in order to get to equity, it would take 100 more years. I think it's now reduced to 50, but 50 years is still a really long time. And that is where we are based on what we believe in the actions we're taking today. But I do see some type of rollbacks from organizations because they're making the assumption that we are already at the baseline and everything is fine and we don't need to necessarily pay attention to this anymore. And that could not be further from the truth. We
Of course.
still have to have an eye and a pulse on it, because if we are not looking at it and asking those questions on a regular basis, we will go back to patterns and behaviors that we are accustomed
Yes.
to and that have historically helped us work. So we still have a ways to go as like an industry. We still have a ways to go, but I would say that there are more and more companies that are in a really good and healthy space and have dedication from the top leadership down to making this a reality.
Yeah, it makes sense. And by the way, I really love the perspective of that you mentioned in terms of, I would probably call it some sort of confirmation bias, meaning when you start to see
Mhm.
something better happening in changing organization, around this topic, you probably start, make things, take things a little bit easier, as if you have tackled the thing. The reality is something that you need to be reminded of every single time. It's not something that you do once and then you forget about it, because the reality is it's not something that unfortunately happens yet as by default. It requires design. So intentional responsibility to make that happen.
Absolutely. And you have to have a sustaining and a process by which you're asking yourselves questions on a fairly consistent
Mm,
basis to ensure. And it could be a 5-second check the box exercise. Is this where we still are? Is this what we're doing? Are we still making progress? Yes,
Yeah.
great. Let's keep moving. Because I've been in organizations, I've led organizations where we thought we were, and then we stopped and took a look and said, oh, we're not making the progress we thought we were making. We slipped a little bit here. How do we continue to move it forward? So
Great. All right. So I have the last question for you, Libby. I mean, we discussed a little bit earlier in this conversation about some key advice, for those leaders. They are actually just now embarking, in new transformation journeys or initiatives. And we mentioned about vision, we mentioned importance about people, the metrics, the diversity. But what other piece of advice, maybe just one or two maximum, that you would like to share based on all your experience about change and transformation that you really, outside of what we already shared, that you will be
Mhm.
happy to share with the audience because it's a kind of a red sign or red flag, sorry, or maybe it's a roadblock, something that you would like to add to.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this applies both in terms of transformation in any type of organization, and it also applies to an individual's personal, professional journey.
Mm.
And this is not something that I came up with, although I truly believe it, but it's that whole notion of determining your why.
Mm.
The why, and I mentioned that earlier, you do anything and really making sure you understand. And I don't mean just, kind of on a cursory level understanding. I mean, really understand the why something needs to happen or is going to happen, or why you are doing a thing, or what you are particularly passionate about in the why is critically important. And so determine that right now. Before you do anything else, determine the why it is that you're doing it, because it also becomes one of those things that you can circle back to and makes it kind of almost a filter by which you can continue to determine, are the actions I'm doing and taking aligned and progressing me to where I want to be. So just determining and spending the right amount of time to determine the why, I think, is critically important. I will tell you also my career why, my personal career why. I'm much more established, but I wish I knew that and knew my why very early in my career. I think it wasn't well defined, and so luckily things worked out. But at some point I really got clear as to what that was. And once you get clear on that, the decisions that you make get much, much easier. You don't ever let go of your values, right? You see your personal and professional
Mm.
values aligning, and you are able to have a voice in a way that you didn't think you were able to have, and a lot more confidence in what your individual contributions are, and then even confidence in any of the plans that you're putting together. So I would say determining that why. If you don't know what it is, stop right now and go figure out the why.
With that said, with that note, I think is we can definitely end this episode because it was amazing final advice, and I do agree 100% on a personal level, but also professional level. Always make clear what's the purpose of what you're doing. Without purpose, there are so many things that are wasted in organization as well. Meetings with no purpose, with no clarity about what are the outcomes of that. Initiative that start without clarity about why they're starting. So I think that is a fantastic final reminder. Libby, thank you so much for being on the show today. Where people should go if they want to know more about you, your career, your story, and maybe they want to make a contact.
Yeah, absolutely. Big proponent of LinkedIn. So you can absolutely find me on LinkedIn. It has my story. It has some content that I put out there for sure. And you can also reach me directly that way through LinkedIn.
Great. And if you do, please refer that you listen, to these episodes so Libby knows why you're reaching out.
Absolutely.
Libby, thank you so much. It's been such an amazing conversation. I love the way how you describe your experience, your approach to change and transformation, and of course, your approach to leadership and people. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.